The crowd had just risen for the bride when the music stopped mid-note. Sunlight flickered across a sea of frozen faces. The aisle, once filled with petals and hope, now framed a figure no one expected. A woman in a white gown, lace identical to the bride's, stood at the entrance, her eyes locked on the groom. Whispers rippled like wildfire through the crowd. The groom's hand trembled, his smile fading into disbelief. The bride's bouquet slipped slightly, petals scattering. The ex took one step forward, calm, deliberate, uninvited. Cameras lifted, hearts pounded. The air thickened with questions that no one dared to ask. Then, with a voice trembling between anger and heartbreak, she said, "You forgot to tell them everything, didn't you? What secret could make a groom go pale on his wedding day? And why was his ex wearing a wedding dress too?" The ex's words sliced through the silence like glass. The officiant froze mid-blessing, unsure whether to step forward or disappear. The bride's lips trembled. Her gaze locked on the groom, who looked ready to faint. The vineyard that had moments ago felt magical now seemed suffocating, every vine twisting with tension. No one dared move, as if the entire crowd had become a living statue. Somewhere, a child asked in a whisper if this was part of the ceremony. The groom opened his mouth, searching for words that refused to come, while the ex's calm eyes dared him to lie. The bride finally stepped back, her heels crunching against fallen petals. Her heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the murmurs. The ex smiled faintly, like someone watching justice unfold. The groom reached toward the bride, but she recoiled, eyes wet and sharp. Every camera lens focused on them now, capturing humiliation in real time. The officiant looked helplessly between them, the script in his hands shaking. It was no longer a wedding. It was a confession waiting to happen. Someone from the crowd gasped as the ex lifted her left hand, a matching engagement ring catching the sunlight. The gasps spread like wildfire. The bride's knees nearly gave out. The groom closed his eyes as if silently begging the world to stop spinning. The ex tilted her head, eyes glinting with unshed tears. "He promised me forever," she whispered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. The bride turned slowly toward the groom, her face drained of color. The silence felt endless. The groom finally spoke, voice trembling, eyes fixed on the ground. "I didn't want it to happen like this." The bride's breath caught, and the crowd collectively leaned closer. The ex took another step forward, her heels echoing against the wooden floor. "Then tell them the truth," she said, her tone steady, almost kind. The bride's bouquet slipped completely from her grasp, scattering across the aisle. And before anyone could process what was happening, the groom raised his head and said something that made the entire crowd fall silent in shock. The crowd's silence turned into an ocean of whispers as the groom's words echoed, too soft to catch, yet heavy enough to chill the air. The bride's fingers twitched as if reaching for something invisible, something steady. The egg's face softened, but her eyes still burned with purpose. The officiant, uncertain whether to intervene, clutched his book tighter. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of roses mixed with panic. The groom stepped down from the altar, his footsteps loud in the hush. Every eye followed him, searching for answers that might break the spell or shatter it completely. He stopped just a few feet from the ex. The distance between them pulsed like a living thing, the kind of silence that screamed louder than words. The bride's chest rose and fell sharply, her breath shaking as she watched the two of them. The groom's voice was barely audible, yet every word landed like a blow. "You shouldn't have come," he said. And the ex gave a small, bitter smile. "You shouldn't have lied?" The air snapped with tension. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Is this real?" as camera flashes went off like lightning. The bride turned to the best man, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Did you know?" His silence was answer enough. Her world tilted, spinning between heartbreak and disbelief. The ex turned her head slightly, catching the exchange with a knowing look. The groom's hands shook as he ran them through his hair, looking like a man watching his life unravel in front of everyone he cared about. The officiant lowered his gaze. The guests began murmuring again, some in pity, some in fascination, all waiting for the next revelation. The ex took another slow step closer, her voice shaking now. "You promised me this same day, this same place," she said, her tone breaking. "You said I'd be the one standing there." The guests gasped in disbelief. The bride's lips parted, her face twisting in confusion and pain. The groom's shoulders sank. "It was years ago," he whispered, though his eyes betrayed guilt. The ex blinked back tears. "Then why is it the same date?" she demanded. The question hit him like thunder. He didn't answer. The silence that followed was unbearable. The bride's veil fluttered as the wind shifted again, carrying whispers through the vineyard like ghosts. She turned to the groom, her voice barely audible but firm. "Tell me she's lying." The groom's throat tightened, his gaze flicking between both women. His silence stretched too long. The ex dropped her bouquet to the ground, petals scattering like shattered promises. The bride's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. "You said she was gone," she whispered. The groom's lips parted, and with a voice that cracked under its own weight, he said, "She was never gone." The vineyard had turned into a storm of whispers. The bride's world tilted, every heartbeat louder than the music that once played. The groom tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. The ex stepped closer, her voice steadier now, as if she had been rehearsing this moment for years. "Tell them why I couldn't stay away," she said. The groom froze. The bride's face tightened, her eyes wet and furious. Every camera in the crowd aimed at them, recording the destruction of what was once called love. The groom took a step toward the ex, his jaw trembling, but the truth was already clawing its way to the surface. The ex reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. Gasps rippled through the guests. Inside glimmered a ring identical to the bride's, the same design, the same engraving. "He gave me this," she said, her voice shaking but proud. 2 years ago, on this very date." The bride's mouth fell open. The groom closed his eyes, his hand covering his face. The ex's tears fell onto the box as she held it up. "You told me I'd be standing here," she whispered. "You told me I'd wear this forever." The bride looked at the ring as if it were poison. The groom lowered his hand, voice hoarse. It wasn't what it looked like. His attempt at control only made things worse. The bride's voice cut through the air, trembling but strong. "Then what was it?" she demanded. "Because that's the same ring, the same day, the same promise." Her words stung like knives. The ex looked at her, almost gently. "He told me I wasn't good enough," she said softly. "That he'd found someone better." The bride's eyes flicked to the groom, whose lips trembled in silence. The truth was no longer something he could hide. A murmur spread through the guests as the sky began to shift into orange and pink. The officiant set his book down, stepping back as if escaping the heat of the truth. The ex's tears turned to anger. "You told me you'd lost everything when we ended," she said, voice cracking. "You didn't lose everything. You just replaced me." The groom took a deep breath, eyes flicking toward the crowd before landing back on her. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he said, his voice trembling with guilt. The bride whispered, "You said I was the only one." His silence was her answer. The ex wiped her tears and took a deep breath. "You didn't just break my heart," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that made everyone lean closer. "You broke a promise that changed my life." The groom's expression shifted, panic mixed with something darker. The bride frowned, confused. The ex looked straight at him, her hands shaking. "Tell her why I disappeared," she said. His eyes widened, color draining from his face. The crowd went silent again, sensing something far more dangerous than heartbreak. The bride's voice quivered. What does she mean? He couldn't answer. The groom's silence stretched until it broke the air in two. Then, flash. The scene shifted in everyone's mind as his trembling voice forced out the words, "Because I left her when she needed me most." The crowd gasped. But before anyone could respond, the world seemed to fade into memory. The vineyard disappeared, replaced by a dim apartment years earlier, rain tapping against the glass. The ex sat on a couch, tear-streaked, holding a pregnancy test in her shaking hands. The groom's voice echoed from that memory. "I can't do this. Not now." She looked up, and her eyes carried the same pain that now haunted this wedding day. She had begged him to stay that night. He had promised he would come back after figuring things out, but he never did. The memory bled into the present. The ex standing in the aisle, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as if she had just escaped a nightmare that followed her for years. The guests murmured in disbelief as the pieces began to fall into place. The bride stared at her groom, searching his face for a lie, for any sign that this wasn't real. But his eyes had already confessed everything. The bride's lips trembled. "You left her because she was pregnant?" Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. The ex looked at her with quiet fury. "He told me he'd come back," she said softly, "but I buried our child alone." The words fell like stones. Gasps rippled through the guests. The groom's legs nearly buckled, his face pale as paper. The bride covered her mouth, shaking her head in disbelief. The egg's eyes glistened with tears that had waited too long to fall. "I thought I could forgive you," she whispered, "until I saw her wearing the dress that was supposed to be mine." A sudden wind swept through the vineyard, scattering petals across the aisle like memories returning to life. The bride stepped back, tears streaming freely now. "You never told me," she whispered, her voice shaking. The groom tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away. The ex closed her eyes, voice barely audible. "I didn't come to ruin your day. I came to make him face what he ran from." The groom sank to his knees, eyes glassy, the weight of guilt pressing him down. The crowd stood in stunned silence, unsure whether to pity him or despise him. The officiant lowered his head as the groom whispered, "I couldn't face what I'd done." His voice cracked, raw and hollow. The ex looked down at him, her tears finally falling. "You can't bury the past," she said. The bride turned away, gripping her gown as if it could hold her together. A phone, somewhere in the crowd, chimed, snapping the moment back into the present. The groom looked up at both women, the one he abandoned and the one he betrayed, and whispered, "I thought starting over would erase it." But the truth had a way of finding its way to the altar. As twilight deepened, the murmurs turned to silence once again. The bride's face hardened, not with sorrow, but with something colder. She looked at the ex, then at the groom, and finally at the crowd. "You both kept secrets," she said softly, "but only one of you came prepared." The ex blinked, confused. The bride stepped closer, her voice trembling with anger. "How did you know today's date? How did you find this place?" The ex hesitated. The groom looked up, realizing too late that the story wasn't finished. "Someone told me," the ex whispered. The bride's eyes widened, her voice shaking. "Who?" The ex's lips parted, but no words came. The bride's expression shifted from pain to realization. Her gaze flicked toward the best man, who looked suddenly pale, his eyes darting away. The silence grew heavy again. "You knew," she whispered, her voice low but deadly. The best man swallowed hard, stammering, I just wanted to help." The groom's jaw tightened, anger breaking through his grief. "You told her," he shouted, his voice echoing through the vines. The ex turned toward the best man too, realization dawning in her eyes. "You sent the message," she said softly. "You wanted this to happen." The best man tried to speak, but the words stumbled out. He was lying to both of you. You deserved to know. The egg's face hardened, so you ambushed us. The bride's voice shook with disbelief. You turned my wedding into revenge? He looked between them, desperate. I thought the truth would set him free, he said, pointing at the groom. The groom's voice broke with fury. You ruined everything. But the bride's tone was cold and final. No, she said, her gaze locked on him. You did. The ex lowered her eyes, tears falling silently. For the first time, the ex and the bride stood on the same side. Their eyes met, not as rivals, but as two women caught in the same lie. The groom tried to speak again, but the words fell flat against the weight of the truth. The bride turned toward the officiant. This ceremony is over, she said firmly. Her voice didn't tremble this time. Guests began to rise from their seats, whispering. The groom took one last step toward her, desperate. Please, don't walk away. The ex turned her head slightly, whispering to the bride, You should. The bride nodded. The bride reached the end of the aisle, her veil catching the wind one last time before tearing free. The groom dropped to his knees again, his voice cracking through the crowd. I never stopped loving you. But no one knew which woman he meant. The ex looked down, then turned her back. The bride kept walking until she disappeared into the vineyard's darkness. The music that had once promised forever now played like a sad echo. The guests stood frozen, phones still recording, capturing not a wedding, but the funeral of a promise. The night deepened into quiet devastation. Guests lingered in small, murmuring clusters, unsure if they'd just witnessed heartbreak or history. The groom stood alone at the altar, tie loosened, staring into the distance where the bride had vanished. The ex stood several feet away, arms crossed, eyes glistening. You still haven't told them everything, she said softly. The groom turned slowly, his voice hoarse. They don't need to know. She shook her head. You owe her the truth. You owe both of us. The groom's hands trembled as he stared at the crowd, at the people he'd deceived, and at the silence that demanded confession. The groom finally stepped forward, his voice cracking. I didn't just leave you, he said, looking at the ex. I ran because I couldn't face what I'd done. It wasn't just fear. It was guilt. The egg's eyes narrowed. You, said the baby didn't survive. He swallowed hard, shaking his head. I lied. The crowd gasped again. Those who had stayed frozen in shock. The egg's breath caught. What do you mean you lied? His next words broke the night apart. Our child didn't die. I gave him up. The egg's knees weakened, and she clutched her chest as if stabbed. The world seemed to stop. The egg's lips trembled, the air leaving her lungs in short, uneven gasps. You gave him away, she whispered, each word barely a sound. The groom nodded slowly, tears sliding down his face. I thought it was the right thing. You were in the hospital, and I was terrified. I didn't think you'd ever forgive me. The ex fell to her knees, sobbing quietly. The crowd murmured like ghosts in the background. The bride, who had reappeared near the vineyard gate, froze as she overheard his words, her hand gripping the wooden fence for support. The bride stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady enough to slice through the night. You said you never had children, she said. The groom turned to face her, his eyes wide with dread. You knew? The ex asked, her voice weak. She didn't, he whispered, barely audible. The bride's eyes filled with tears as she whispered. I thought I was marrying a man who told me everything. The ex looked at her, broken yet strangely calm. Now you know what he's capable of, she said. The groom took a step toward both of them, his voice breaking. He's alive. That's why I couldn't stay away. I found him. The bride stared at him, frozen in disbelief. You found your son? The groom nodded, his voice trembling. He's 5 now. I've been visiting him. His adoptive parents don't know who I am. The egg's face twisted with anguish. You've seen him all these years, and you never told me? Her voice broke on the last word. The groom fell silent, unable to defend himself. The bride looked between them, realizing this wasn't just a ruined wedding. It was the unveiling of a life built on hidden sins. "So that's the truth you were hiding," she whispered. "The one you thought would never come back?" The night had turned cold, but no one dared to move. The bride stood motionless, her veil gone, her heart too heavy to cry. The groom wiped his tears, but it did nothing to soften what he'd done. The ex whispered, her voice trembling with rage and pain, "You watched him grow without me." He looked at her, pleading. "I was trying to protect you." She shook her head. "You were protecting yourself." The bride finally stepped closer, her voice cutting through the silence. "You lied to both of us, and to your own child." The groom fell silent, the weight of every secret collapsing around him. The ex took a step closer to the groom, her voice almost breaking. "What's his name?" she asked, her hands trembling. The groom hesitated before whispering, "Ellie." The sound of the name shattered her last bit of restraint. She pressed her hand to her mouth, sobbing quietly. "I dreamed of him every night," she said. "Now I can't even hold him." The bride's voice came softly from behind them. "Maybe you still can." The ex turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" The bride's gaze hardened. "He deserves a mother who didn't run away, and a father who tells the truth." The groom looked at the bride, panic in his eyes. "Don't do this," he begged, but she didn't waver. "You've already done it," she replied softly. The ex turned toward her, guilt and confusion warring across her face. "Why are you helping me?" The bride gave a faint, sad smile. "Because I know what it feels like to be betrayed by someone you trusted completely." The groom's shoulders collapsed under the weight of her words. The ex reached out, her voice breaking. "You're stronger than I ever was." The bride shook her head slowly. "No, I just know when to walk away." The guests began to leave quietly, the air thick with pity and disbelief. The ex stood near the altar, lost in thought. The bride approached her, handing over a folded paper. "This is his name," she said, "and the contact of the agency that adopted him. You deserve to know where he is." The ex's hands shook as she took it. "Why are you giving this to me?" she asked, voice trembling. The bride smiled faintly, tears glistening in her eyes. "Because he was yours first." Behind them, the groom stood in silence, watching everything he loved slip away under the stars. The bride turned away from the altar one last time, walking into the vineyard's darkness as the ex clutched the paper to her chest. The groom sank onto the steps, head in his hands, the sound of his sobs mixing with the wind. The ex looked back only once, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't undo what you did, but maybe I can find him." The bride's silhouette faded among the vines, her wedding gown trailing like a ghost. The lights flickered, then dimmed completely. The guests were gone, the music silent, and all that remained was the echo of vows that never should have been spoken.